Well, good afternoon. As Daniel said, my name's Andrew Lynch, and I've got the great pleasure of being the Dean of the Faculty of Law and Justice here, in which the Kaldor Centre is a very prominent part of our operations. As we draw this very successful day to a close, it's fitting that our final keynote is someone whose life's work has been about building bridges, responding to the theme of today's discussions: bridges between communities, between truth and justice, and between principle and practice. Hugh de Kretser has spent more than 2 decades advancing human rights in Australia. Since July last year, he has served as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, leading national efforts to strengthen human rights protection and accountability. Before taking on this role, as I'm sure many are aware, Hugh led the UNSW Justice Commission, the first formal truth-telling process into historical and ongoing injustices experienced by First Nations people in Victoria. His work there showed that bridge building begins with truth, with listening, with reckoning, and creating the shared understanding on which justice depends. Earlier, as CEO of the Human Rights Law Centre, Hugh led the organisation's work defending the rights of refugees and people seeking asylum. So throughout his career, from his early days as a community lawyer to his leadership at the national level, Hugh's work shows how rights frameworks and moral courage can guide us towards common ground. Please join me in welcoming the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Hugh de Kretser.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here and see many friends and colleagues who I've worked with over the years. As Andrew said, I worked in mainstream human rights issues, including a deep focus on refugee and asylum seeker issues for about 10 years at the Human Rights Law Centre, and then I shifted to 2 years working on truth-telling in Aboriginal justice in Victoria. I didn't lead the UNSW Justice Commission. I was the CEO, reporting to 5 commissioners, 4 of whom were Aboriginal, and the chair, Aunty Eleanor Burke, an incredibly inspiring individual. So I went out of mainstream human rights issues for 2 years and then came back into it as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and some of it was depressing to see the things that were exactly the same or were getting worse, and some of it there was positive change, and I'll talk about that. But just to give thanks to the Kaldor Centre, what did I do when I started this job? I went to the Kaldor Centre's website and looked at your information and statements on policy, and it really was the first place that I went to bring myself back up to speed after 2 years focused on Aboriginal justice issues. So always admired the work of the centre and the people in it, and great to be here at this conference. We're meeting on the lands of the Bedegal people, and I acknowledge their elders and ancestors and their continuing and unbroken connection to country and their culture. No one chooses to be a refugee. Refugees are people forced to flee persecution and violence, leaving their homes to seek freedom and safety elsewhere. Recognising our common humanity, we have a global responsibility to cooperate and to protect refugees. And the Refugee Convention is the international community's commitment to work together to protect people fleeing persecution and violence. When Australia agreed to be bound by the Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, we agreed to protect refugees who came to our country seeking safety. Australia's provided safety and a new life in peace and freedom for close to 1 million refugees and their families since World War II, a milestone that reflects decades of humanitarian commitment by our nation. We continue to provide an important refugee resettlement program, giving up to 20,000 humanitarian visas a year, and Australia's contribution is vital in this regard, as relatively few countries formally resettle refugees. People receiving these humanitarian visas get support from highly regarded settlement services, and we have a reputation as one of the world's most successful multicultural societies. We should absolutely celebrate all of this. But over the years, key parts of our refugee policies have hardened. For those who've come across the seas seeking safety, Australia's policies remain amongst the harshest in the world. Instead of protecting people who come to our shores by boat, successive Australian governments have harmed them, intercepting them, turning them back, detaining those that do reach Australia, and transferring them to remote offshore islands. The Australian Human Rights Commission has consistently raised concerns about the harms caused by Australia's immigration detention, asylum and offshore processing policies. We've continually called for these policies to change and for offshore processing to end. There is a better way. Today I'll talk about our human rights obligations to refugees and people seeking asylum, a better approach to people seeking safety, and the worrying polarisation, racism and anti-migration sentiment that is rising in Australia and globally, and how we might respond. What are human rights? Human rights are standards that governments around the world have agreed to meet to ensure that everyone can lead a safe, free and dignified life. Human rights belong to all of us, no matter who we are or where we come from, what we look like or what we believe. Human rights reflect values like equality, freedom, dignity, respect, kindness, compassion, thinking of one another, looking after each other. The modern human rights movement emerged out of the horrors of World War II, when the international community came together and said never again. To promote global peace, development and prosperity, they came up with new international laws and institutions, most notably the UN Charter 80 years ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Australia was closely involved in drafting and supporting the Universal Declaration. We pushed for it to be stronger. We actually pushed for an international court to rule on international human rights issues. An Australian, William Hodgson, was one of just 9 people on the drafting committee, led by the extraordinary Eleanor Roosevelt. Out of the mass slaughter and human suffering, these drafters and the people who worked with them created a document that should rightly be celebrated as one of the pinnacles of human achievement. The first article of the Universal Declaration proclaims that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And these simple words say to every one of us, no matter who you are or where you are, you have value, you deserve dignity because of the mere fact that you are human. These words are grounded in our common humanity. And this global declaration of human equality at the time was revolutionary. It expressly rejected the idea that some humans are worth less than others, the notion at the heart of slavery, genocide, colonisation, eugenics, so-called scientific racism, and more. The Universal Declaration recognises that people have the right to seek safety from being persecuted. Article 14 says everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Other articles protect people's rights to freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, as well as the right not to be arbitrarily detained, not to be locked up unfairly. Subsequent treaties which Australia agreed to comply with, including the Refugee Convention, guarantee these rights under international law. Specifically, the Refugee Convention confirms that people have the right not to be expelled or returned to a country where their life or freedom would be threatened, except under very strict, narrow circumstances. The right not to be punished for irregular entry or presence in the territory of a nation like Australia that has agreed to comply with the Refugee Convention. Rights around work, housing, education, freedom of movement and social security. Since coming to power, the current Australian government has taken some positive steps around protecting the rights of refugees. These include granting permanent protection to over 20,000 people previously on temporary visas, accepting New Zealand's offer to resettle people from our offshore processing system, and agreeing with Tuvalu to provide a migration pathway for people affected by climate change. And these are in addition to the pledges made at the Global Refugee Forum. But aspects of the policies of successive Australian governments violate our human rights obligations. To meet our obligation to protect people fleeing persecution and other serious harms, we have to fairly and properly assess their refugee claims. Yet people who come by boat are intercepted at sea and turned back following cursory screenings that carry serious risks of returning people to harm. Historically, more than 80% of people seeking asylum who arrive by boat at Australia over a 40-year period have been found to be refugees. Yet only a small fraction of people who are screened at sea under our turn-back policy are found to have a potential refugee claim, highlighting just how flawed these processes are. The Australian government mandatorily detains anyone who arrives without a valid visa, including children and their families. People arriving by boat are banned from settling in freedom and safety in Australia, even if they're found to be refugees. Instead, they're transferred to Nauru, a tiny island nation 3,000 kilometres off the coast of Queensland, smaller than the size of Melbourne Airport, with a population of around 10,000 people. There have been well-documented human rights violations and suffering associated with this offshore processing system. More recently, Australia's policies entered a troubling new chapter following the High Court decision in the NZYQ case. NZYQ was an important case where the High Court ruled that the Australian government cannot indefinitely detain a person without a valid visa in immigration detention where there's no real prospect of their removal from Australia in the foreseeable future. The court recognised that the Australian Constitution placed important limits on the ability of a government to lock people up indefinitely. Most of the people affected directly by this case are refugees and stateless people who have lived in Australia for years. Many have deep community ties, including family members and children who are Australian citizens. Some had committed very serious crimes, served their prison sentences, and have since been subjected to conditions including curfews and electronic monitoring. Others had committed lesser convictions, some had not committed any crime. Instead of accepting our responsibility to manage these people and support their rehabilitation and reintegration, Australia struck a new deal with Nauru to deport them there. Australia has reportedly agreed to pay up to $2.5 billion for the 30-year agreement, an upfront payment of $408 million and $70 million annually. And in August, the Australian government, through Parliament, passed a new law stripping refugees and other migrants of their right to procedural fairness when the government attempts to remove them overseas to third countries. As a human rights lawyer, I've been involved in many refugee cases and advocacy to address the harms caused by the policies of successive Australian governments, particularly around offshore processing in Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. These cases were heartbreaking and highlighted the human cost of the decisions of successive governments to evade the fundamental promise at the heart of the Refugee Convention, to protect people fleeing harm. There is no doubt that protecting people who are forced to leave their homes, fleeing danger, is a complex and challenging global problem, a problem that is increasing in size. The answer to this problem is not to spend vast amounts of money harming innocent people to deter others from trying to ask us for protection. The answer is not shifting the responsibility to protect refugees onto other countries who are less capable of supporting them, like Bangladesh, Thailand, Uganda, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and others. The answer is not outsourcing our obligations to protect people to Nauru or other cash-strapped nations. There is a better way. We can have fair, well-managed refugee policies that comply with our human rights obligations to people seeking our protection. We can do this while preventing dangerous journeys by sea, combating human trafficking, and maintaining the integrity of our migration system. The answer lies in providing people with safe pathways to protection, providing better options than the terrible choice of risking your life by staying in your home country where you face persecution and violence, living in unstable, dire conditions in another country, or risking your life on a dangerous boat journey. We need to redirect the enormous political, financial, and diplomatic resources away from our current harmful approach towards a better, more humane approach. And 4 measures Australia could immediately adopt are: number 1, work more meaningfully with regional countries like Indonesia and Malaysia to improve conditions and legal protections for people seeking asylum there. Hafsa mentioned it, recent progress like Thailand allowing refugees in camps along its border with Myanmar to legally work. This should be championed and expanded where possible. We should also be working with our regional partners to save lives at sea. In May this year, 427 Rohingya refugees died when their boats capsized off the coast of Myanmar as they attempted a boat journey to seek safety. And I think UNHCR said 1 in 5 people have died or disappeared in boat journeys this year. As co-chair of the Regional Cooperation Mechanism, the Bali process, a key partner to ASEAN, Australia can play a stronger role in coordinating maritime operations and preventing deaths at sea. And this should be centred on human rights, not on containment or deterrence. We need to ensure that refugees and people seeking asylum have other options than resorting to a dangerous, deadly journey. Secondly, we should redirect some of the billions of dollars we spend on deterrence measures to increase funding to UNHCR and refugee-led organisations to process and support refugees and people seeking asylum in other countries. The Refugee Council's analysis shows that Australian governments have now spent over $13 billion on Australia's offshore processing system since the policy was introduced in 2012. We know that the lack of support for refugees in other countries, like Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, is a factor that makes it far more likely that they will attempt dangerous boat journeys to Australia and elsewhere. Thirdly, we should increase the number of refugees we take from the UN resettlement pool. In in the current budget, 25-26, the refugee and humanitarian program will remain at 20,000 places. It should be much higher. Again, with thanks to the Refugee Council's analysis, we know that over 10 years to December 22, Australia recognised or resettled 180,000 refugees. 0.75% of the global total recognised or resettled in that period. On this measure, Australia was ranked 30th overall, 41st on a per capita basis, and 77th relative to gross domestic product. We need to increase our contribution. We should also increase complementary pathways such as work, education, family reunification and community sponsorship for refugees, asylum seekers and migrants. And these should be in addition to our core humanitarian program. The Labor Party is committed in its policy platform to increase both the humanitarian program up to 27,000 places in addition to an additional 10,000 complementary pathway places. Given the global need, this needs to happen urgently. And fourthly, we should urge other nations with the capacity to do so to follow our lead. Instead of inspiring others to adopt harsh deterrence measures that breach people's rights, by taking a more humane approach, we can not only lead ourselves, but we can encourage others to do the same. We can only address global refugee issues through global cooperation. And of course, we also need to address the root causes why people flee, promoting peace and human rights through diplomacy, leadership, accountability, and development assistance. I want to end by talking about addressing the rising polarisation, racism and anti-migrant sentiment in Australia. Australia is a successful multicultural nation. The Scanlon Foundation surveys show continuing and strong support for multiculturalism. However, the surveys show that support, while still strong, has been dropping in recent years. Other surveys point to anti-migration sentiment rising, and there is no doubt that racism has risen in Australia since the failed Voice referendum and since the Israel-Hamas war 2 years ago. We've seen increased anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism and prejudice against Israeli Australians. We have the recent anti-migration rallies that targeted in particular the Australian Indian community and other communities. And there have been periodic calls from some politicians to abandon Australia's long-standing bipartisan commitment to a non-discriminatory migration policy. At the same time, mis and disinformation is being spread on social media, amplified by algorithms that prioritise and monetise division and outrage. These are worrying times at home and abroad. We can't be complacent and we must respond effectively. In doing so, we need to take care around understanding the different specific dimensions of these issues, whether they relate to refugees, asylum seekers, broader migration, racism, diversity and equality initiatives, or human rights more broadly. But I do believe there are common themes requiring common responses. And I believe that despite the challenges, there are strong fundamental values around fairness and compassion that help us here in Australia. Since I started this job about 16 months ago, I've thought and read a lot about Australian values and what it means to be Australian. What is it that unites us as Australians, and how do we define what we stand for as a nation? And I looked at our citizenship booklet, much maligned in the 1990s, reformed by the Rudd government and still being used today for new citizens. What does it say about what it means to be Australian? It says, Australians believe in shared values such as the dignity and freedom of each person. Equal opportunity for men and women and the rule of law. It says Australian citizenship is about living out these values in everyday life. It goes on to describe other core values including freedom of speech, freedom of association and freedom of religion. The Citizenship Pledge, which all new citizens make, includes a promise to respect Australia's rights and liberties. Even people seeking visas in Australia must agree to an Australian values statement, which reads, I understand that Australian society values respect for the freedom and dignity of the individual, freedom of religion, freedom of speech and freedom of association, the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, equality of opportunity for all people, a fair go that embraces mutual respect, tolerance, compassion for those in need, and equal opportunity for all. So it seems that human rights values, including fairness, compassion, and dignity, are at the heart of what it means to be Australian, or at least what we say it means in our citizenship booklet to be Australian. The Prime Minister in his election victory speech in May echoed this when he said, today the Australian people have voted for Australian values, for fairness, aspiration and opportunity for all, for the strength to show courage in adversity and kindness to those in need. So let us all work together to build our national unity on the enduring foundations of fairness, equality and respect for one another. I love these words. We need to reaffirm and strengthen them and live up to the values through our actions and apply them to everyone in our community, including those who come seeking safety to our shores. This will help address rising racism, polarisation and division. It will help to unite us. And there are many ways we can do this. At the Human Rights Commission, some of the things we think the Australian government should do is establish a Human Rights Act, legislation that translates the promises we've made at international law to protect human rights into Australian domestic law. And Kylie Tink's here, and thank you, Kylie, for your leadership on this. This is a missing piece of Australia's democracy. It would fix holes in our human rights safety net and build a stronger culture of protecting rights. For me, it would be like a reverse citizenship pledge where the Australian government and the Australian Parliament says to the people of Australia, we agree to uphold these values. We promise to uphold these rights and liberties in our engagement with you. We should establish a national human rights education plan. We need to build a better understanding of human rights and address lagging civics education standards. We need to implement the Australian Human Rights Commission's National Anti-Racism Framework, 63 recommendations to eliminate racism in this country across sectors like health, education, media, workplaces and the justice sector. Fairer, more humane refugee policies showing kindness to those in need are part of this picture. For the refugee and human rights sectors, we need to do a better job of storytelling to humanise refugee policy issues. This must be done ethically and it must be led by refugees. In my previous work with people detained on Nauru and Manus, we worked hard to create safe and ethical opportunities for them to tell their stories if they chose to do so, their hopes and dreams for a new life in freedom and safety. Proximity to human stories brings empathy, compassion and change. Governments know this. That's why they make it hard to achieve this proximity, detaining people in remote, hard-to-reach places, limiting access to journalists, advocates and oversight bodies, and shrouding so-called on-water matters in secrecy. There are many examples that show the potential for change and that should give us hope. The Murugapan family from Billawela, against the odds with the support of a regional Australian community, they told their story and won support from across Australia and are now able to live their lives in freedom and safety. The Let Them Stay campaign to prevent the deportation of babies born in Australia to harm on Nauru is another good example. Working with the churches, working with civil society, generated an enormous outpouring of compassion for those people. We provide protection because it's the right thing to do. But we should also better explain how the economic and social benefits, we should better explain the economic and social benefits that refugees bring to Australia, particularly when you look at the long-term impact from research like Graham Hugo and others. We need to tell more stories of the rich and diverse contributions refugees continue to make to Australian society It was good to watch Mohammed's story. I watched it online this morning, your talk this morning, and reflect on the theme of this conference in building bridges. And some takeaways for me from what you said with my own thoughts are, number one, we need to get out of the echo chambers. We need to engage people with a range of views in respectful dialogue. We need to work harder to find common ground. We need to be more curious and less critical. We need to hold firm to our human rights principle and stand with those communities whose rights are at risk, but shouting at people and telling them they're wrong won't help. We need to bring people with us and show how everyone benefits when we protect people's rights, how our societies and our communities are stronger, healthier, and better off when we protect human rights. We need to highlight the success stories, big and small, and build the community understanding and connections. And evidence from Canada shows the promise of community sponsorship schemes in building stronger support locally and more broadly for more compassionate refugee policies. Thirdly, I liked what you said about a generational approach and not working in political cycles. For me, this underscores the importance of human rights education and building a culture, a much stronger culture of understanding human rights and respecting human rights. And finally, we need to proactively, strategically, and effectively communicate. If we vacate the public debates, the void will be filled by hostile narratives. And it can be easy to lose hope when things are so challenging as they are globally. And I was at the UN Association Conference yesterday celebrating or reflecting on 80 years of the UN. And there's no doubt things are grim globally. UN's budget is being cut by 30%. Core foundations and consensus around human rights are being challenged. And that applies to the refugee sector as well. But I think there are strong, fundamental Australian values around fairness and compassion, and they provide a basis for us to push for better, more humane refugee policies that live up to the human rights promises we've made globally. Because of what's happening globally, Australia absolutely needs to be the best that we can be. We need to work strategically and effectively together, and if we do, I firmly believe we can build better bridges in this divided world. Thank you.